So now please give a warm Aspen Y Fellows welcome to Elliot Gerson and Michael Morell.
Well, thank you very much, and I'll assume that that was also in reference to me and the length of my questions. And it's always really a pleasure to be out here. I love coming out to Y. I wish we could come out more often. It's especially nice to be here for a holiday party, although looking outside, if it were not for the fact that there are no trees, I think this would be a July 4th party. So it really is a privilege for me to have the opportunity to have this conversation with really one of the most respected national security experts, not really just in the country, and significantly from both sides of the aisle, which is not something that happens very often, but really from both sides of both oceans as well, because he's someone who's been not just at the side of presidents, but someone who's come to be respected by our allies all over the world. And I really do urge you to read this book. It's a cliche to say one doesn't or can't put down a book. This is a book for which it is absolutely the case. It's extraordinarily well written, and as you heard, the author really was present at so many of the critical junctions that this country has had over the last 30 years. And actually it really makes it rather difficult to know where to begin in a conversation with him. And I'll say also, because I do urge you to buy the book, because of his generosity, some of the proceeds of this book actually go to the CIA Officers Memorial Fund. And you will meet some of the heroes that he is interested in supporting and commemorating in this extraordinary book. But again, where to begin? You know, it's all here, whether it's the birth of Islamic terrorism, whether it's 9/11, whether it's weapons of mass destruction and our efforts in Iraq, whether it's Abbottabad and the location of Bin Laden, the killing of Bin Laden, whether it's in the debates that still envelop all of us about things like enhanced interrogation techniques or rendition, Edward Snowden, ISIS. It's really all here. And it gives you a picture, direct hand. And again, it's fascinating, but needless to say, a career civil service professional like this is not going to reveal secrets in here that the CIA would not allow him to. It's all been cleared. But I don't think there's a page in this book where you're not going to discover things that you never knew before. So I do have to start, and I'll start really with a question about the title, which is The Great War of Our Time. And what I'd like to ask first is just when did this war begin? And how long do you think it's going to last?
So first of all, it's great. It's absolutely great to be here. Great thanks to Elliot for taking the time to have this conversation. You all heard that I was acting director twice. So I have the acting thing down. So if you ever need somebody to act, I'm your guy. When I was acting director the second time, it was between Dave Petraeus' departure from the agency and John Brennan showing up. I went to a restaurant in Arlington, Virginia with my wife, and we were in this big armored Suburban that pulled into the parking lot, and there was a guy who was sitting on her side of the car as we pulled in, and he was looking and looking, trying to figure out who was in this armored Suburban. And so she gets out of her side of the car, and he says to her, "Is that somebody important?" And she says, "Nah, he's just acting important." So when did this war begin? That is a great question. I don't talk about this in the book, but I think the war begins in 1979. 1979. I think it begins in two places in 1979. It begins in Iran in 1979 with the overthrow of the Shah and the installation of the Islamic Republic. Actually, a bit of a gap, right, between those two events. the taking of the U.S. Embassy, the radicalization of Iranian society, et cetera, et cetera. And then the other place in 1979 that a lot of people, many people don't even know about, is Saudi Arabia, 1979, the takeover of the Grand Mosque by Islamic extremists, the killing of hundreds of people. I think that's when this begins, right? That long ago. I don't think this really becomes part of the American consciousness until 9/11. I think it becomes part of the American consciousness in 1998 with the bombing of the 2 U.S. embassies in East Africa by Al-Qaeda. But I don't think it becomes fully part of our consciousness until 9/11.
And you talk a lot in the book about both of those, obviously. Let's, again, just picking from all the extraordinary things to talk about here, let's start with, when did Osama bin Laden first get on your screen?
So I was, for quite some time, a East Asian specialist. I worked on East Asia for probably half of my career. A little bit of Southeast Asia, a little bit of China, a lot of Japan, and an awful lot of North Korea. And I did that for 15, 16 years, both as an analyst and as a manager of analysts. But in 1998, I became George Tenet's executive assistant when he was director of Central Intelligence. And it was really at that moment that I got that job that I saw how obsessed he was with this group called Al-Qaeda, how concerned the whole agency was. And the agency is a very compartmented place, right? So if you're working on East Asia, you really don't know what's happening everywhere else. So I really, when I started to work for George, I saw the importance of what was happening on the international terrorism front. It became part of my daily life. So that's when I became aware of this group. That's when I became aware of this guy named Osama Bin Laden, who we really weren't sure at that point who he was and what role he played. We weren't sure if he was the leader of this terrorist group or he was just a financier and supporter. That would come actually later in 1998, but that's sort of my first introduction to it.
And just, I guess, I think it was a couple of years after that the August 8th memo, which became very famous in the briefing for President Bush, bin Laden determined to strike in the United States.
Right.
Tell us what led up to that conclusion.
Yeah. So 2001, from January 4th, 2001 to January 4th, 2002, I was President Bush's daily intelligence briefer. So I was with him every morning, 6 days a week, briefing him on what was happening in the world and how CIA thought about it, right? How we thought he should think about it. And I did that for him 6 days a week, wherever he was in the world. So if he was in Washington in the Oval Office, or sometimes in the residence at the White House, if he was traveling overseas, I was with him. If he was traveling in the United States, I was with him. And if he was, at home at the ranch in Texas, I was there. So I was with him on September 11th. There's a whole chapter in the book about that. But this August 6th memo that we gave to him, the story about that is that from April 2001 to early July 2001, there was a very, very large amount of intelligence reporting saying that Al-Qaeda is going to conduct a very significant attack, possibly multiple attacks, possibly catastrophic attacks. But there was absolutely no information on where, when, or how, right? In fact, the information we did have tended to point to an attack overseas, tended to point to an attack in the Middle East. So every time that Director Tenet and he joined me every morning, and as I say in the book, it's kind of weird having your boss in the room with you when you're doing your work, right? It's kind of like having the coach in the huddle, right, if you're the quarterback. Every time the director and I would share one of these pieces of intelligence with the president about this Al-Qaeda planning for this big attack, he would ask us, is there any indication that this could be in the United States? And every time he asked the question, we gave him exactly the same answer, which is there's nothing in the intelligence that points to location, right, here or overseas. But Mr. President, Bin Laden would like nothing more than to bring the fight here, and that is his intent. So you can't rule it out, right? Every time he asked. So because he was asking that question so often, I asked our analyst to write this piece. I asked the analyst to write a piece about Bin Laden's intent to strike the United States. And that's what the August 6th piece was. There was, contrary to myth, there was absolutely nothing in the piece. And you can read it. You can go online and you can read this piece. It was the first declassified presidential daily brief piece ever. You can read it. There is nothing in there that is evidence of the attack coming here, right? Of that particular attack coming here. Says he wants to, says historically how he's tried to do it, but doesn't say it's it's going to happen here. I did not read it myself as a hair on fire piece. You got to do something immediately, and neither did he. That's the story.
So you were just saying that you were with him those 6 mornings a week, and that you were with him on 9/11. So just take us to Saratoga, Florida, where he was, where you were, and again, you'll have a much longer description when you all get the book, but just tell us what that was like when the first plane hit, when the second plane hit, what the president was said.
So my morning briefing was from 8 to 8:30 in his in his suite at the Colony Resorts Hotel. Absolutely nothing in that briefing that morning on terrorism, contrary to what some people have said. 8:30 comes and we go down to the motorcade, and I jump in the senior staff van with Ari Fleischer, who was then the president's spokesperson, with Karl Rove, with Dan Bartlett, and we were on our way to the school, Booker T Elementary School, when Ari Fleischer's phone rang. It was one of those old flip phones, right, that nobody has anymore. And he opened it up, and he was on the phone for about 10 seconds and closed the phone up, and he turned around and he said to me, "Michael, do you know anything about a plane hitting the World Trade Center?" And I said, "No, I don't know anything, haven't heard that, but I'll make some calls and try to find out." So I did, and at that moment, I thought exactly what the president thought, right, when he heard that this was a small plane, lost in bad weather, hitting the towers, this is an accident. And that lasted only as long as it took me to call the CIA Operations Center and for them to tell me that this was a large commercial jet. Right? Large commercial jets don't have those kind of accidents. And then I walked into the staff room where all the senior staff was while the president was in the classroom with the kids next door, and it was on the TV that was in that room that we saw the second plane hit, and at that moment, right, we all knew that this was terrorism, no doubt about it. The rest of the day for me was a mix of the intensity of doing my job and the surreal. Give you a couple of examples of
flying around.
the intensity of doing my job, right? So the president, we're flying from Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, where we stopped for food and water because we didn't know how long we were going to be flying around. And we kicked a whole bunch of people off the plane who had nothing to do with national security. Remember, we were on this domestic political trip to Florida about the president's education policy. So a lot of those people got kicked off. So we're flying from Barksdale Air Force Base to Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, and the president asked to see me. And it was the president, Andy Carr, his chief of staff, and me in his little office on Air Force One. And I walk in and I sit down, and the president says, "Michael, who did this?" And I said, "Mr. President, I haven't seen any intelligence yet that would indicate that we know with any certainty who did this, so you're going to get my personal opinion here." And he said, "I understand what you're saying, now get on with it." I said, "Mr. President, there are 2 countries in the world who have the capability to do something like this, Iran and Iraq. but neither of those countries has anything to gain from doing something like this, and they have everything to lose, so I do not believe it was one of them. I said, Mr. President, you can bet a lot that the trail is going to take us to Al-Qaeda here and to Osama Bin Laden. In fact, I told the President that I would bet my children's future on this. I've never told them that. And then he said, when will we know who did this? And that's the kind of question a president asks you, right, as a briefer, for which you don't know the answer. You can't tell him we're going to know in a day or we're going to know in a week. You just don't know, right? So one of the things you do as an analyst is you provide context. So I provided him context to think about his question. And the context I provided was to go back over 4 or 5 previous terrorist attacks against the United States. Khobar Towers, East Africa bombings, Cole attack, a whole bunch of attacks, and how long did it take us in each case to find out with certainty who did it? And it varied dramatically. East Africa, it was a couple of days. Khobar Towers was a year and a half, 2 years. The Cole attack was a couple of months. So I said, Mr. President, we may know soon, and then again, it may take some time. So that's kind of the example of the intensity of doing my job. Later that evening when we were flying back to Andrews, CIA sent me some intelligence to share with him, a particular intelligence report that a foreign intelligence service had shared with us, which is very common. And it basically said that Al-Qaeda is planning a second wave attack. What happened today was the first wave, and there is a second wave coming, which turned out to be true. There was a second wave coming. I got disrupted. But that's kind of the example of the intensity of doing my job. The example of the surreal was when you land at Andrews Air Force Base, flying from west to east, out the left side of the aircraft on the final approach, you can see the Pentagon. And as we were on final approach to Andrews that night, the president's military aide, right, the guy who carries the nuclear football around, is looking out the window, the left side of the aircraft, and motions for me to come over. And so I go over and I look out the window, and there's a fighter jet on the wingtip of Air Force One. And the military aide said, there's another one on the other wingtip. They're from the DC Air National Guard. At that point, right, at that point in the day, every commercial flight in the United States had been grounded. So what were they worried about? He told me that their job, the concern, right, was a surface-to-air missile on final approach. He said their job, should somebody fire a surface-to-air missile at Air Force One, their job was to put themselves between that missile and Air Force One. And as you're looking, right, as you're looking out at this fighter jet on the wingtip of Air Force One, you're so close that you can see the facial features of the pilot. You can see the pilot looking at you. And in the distance, you can see the still burning Pentagon. Smoke and fire from the still burning Pentagon. So that's an example of the surreal. So the whole day was like that. You know, off and on, work, the intensity of the work in the surreal.
Well, it's hard to follow something like that with a changed subject, so let's stay on that thread and talk to us about Abu Ahmed and how you determined, not you personally, but you and your associates, that he was the key to where Osama bin Laden might actually be hiding.
So we lost Osama bin Laden in early January 2004. He was penned in the mountains of Tora Bora in Afghanistan, and he snuck out. In fact, on my very last day of briefing the president, January 4th, 2002, I had to tell him that. And I've never seen him angrier at any time, and I've known the man for a long time now. And he yelled at me, right? He yelled at me like it was my fault. And I'm sitting there thinking, I had nothing to do with this, Mr. President. But he took it out on the guy sitting in front of him. So we lost him. We lost him in early January 2002. We followed every single lead. We got hundreds of leads over the years about where he was, about somebody who could take us to him. We followed every one of those leads until it was dry, until the thread could take us no further. One of those leads first surfaced in 2002. So in 2002, a detainee in the custody of a foreign government, a North African government, told us about a guy named Abu Ahmed. It's all he had at that point. That's a nom de guerre. It's a nickname. You know, Al Qaeda would give its fighters nicknames. That was his Al Qaeda nickname, Abu Ahmed. It's not his true name. Told us about this guy named Abu Ahmed who was close to Bin Laden prior to 9/11, and who was close to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, after 9/11. That's what he told us. So when you get something like that, how do you follow up on it? You follow up on it by asking every detainee that you can put the question in front of, whether they're in somebody else's custody or whether they're in your custody. So we asked every detainee about him, and we learned quite a bit as they told us. What we learned was that one guy told us that he had been a courier for Bin Laden. You know, it was 1999. The New York Times runs a story that said that the U.S. intelligence community can listen to Bin Laden's phone calls. At that point, Bin Laden has never made a phone call the rest of his life. All right, so we lost those comms because of that New York Times piece. So he operated with couriers. Right? You want to talk to the boss, you write it down on a piece of paper, you give it to a courier, gives it to a courier, gives it to a courier who takes it to him. Right? That was the method he communicated with his senior operatives. So you're asking these detainees, do you know about a guy named Abu Ahmed? And they're telling us all this stuff. One is that he's a courier. Another tells us that he's the kind of guy who could even be living with Bin Laden. One courier told us. We asked two very senior al-Qaeda operatives, one of them Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, if they knew Abu Ahmed, and both of them said one of them said never heard of him, and the other one said used to work for al-Qaeda, left al-Qaeda a long, long time ago. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed then goes back to his cell. At this point, he is in CIA custody, one of our secret prisons. Goes back to his cell. Of course, we have the cells wired, right? And he tells all the other prisoners, nobody say anything about the courier.
Hint.
So now, all of a sudden, this guy has our attention, right? This guy goes to the top of the possibility list, right? Work this as hard as we possibly can. So it took us 3 or 4 years, I forget, read the book, it's in there, but 3 or 4 years to find out what his true name is. It took us another couple of years to find out where on the planet he actually was, somewhere in Pakistan, and then another year or so to find out where he lives at this place in Abbottabad. So in August of 2010, I'm the deputy director. Leon Panetta is the director. We're having a 3 times a week meeting with our counterterrorism guys. And at the end of one of the meetings, they say to us, can we have a private meeting with you in the director's office? So it was the chief of our counterterrorism center, the senior analyst from the center, and the director and I. And the director of the center says, we found a guy named Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. So he was Kuwaiti. He was from Kuwait. We found a guy named Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti. The name meant nothing to the director and I. And we didn't know this one of maybe 50 threads, right, that we were trying to find Bin Laden at that point. So they told us the story. And then they described the house that they followed Abu Ahmed to. Right? And the house had 12 to 18 foot walls topped with barbed wire. It was sectioned off, so very difficult, wall sectioning it off, very difficult to move from one section to another. It had 2 gates you had to get through to get a vehicle into the compound. The main house had very few windows. The main house had a balcony off the third floor with a privacy wall blocking the view, right, of the people on the balcony. I remember to this day Director Panetta saying, "Who has a balcony with a privacy wall? Isn't the whole purpose of a balcony to be able to look out?" And I remember the senior analyst saying, "Exactly, exactly." So we briefed the president. In early September 2010. And the president gave us 2 orders. Number 1, don't tell anybody. Do not tell anybody. This was the best kept secret that I've ever been involved in 33 years. Don't tell anybody else in the government. So it wasn't for several months before we told senior officials at the Department of Defense. The Secretary of State was not told until 2 months before the raid. The Attorney General of the United States, the Director of the FBI were not told until the day before the raid. The Secretary of Homeland Security wasn't told until the morning of the raid. This was extremely closely held. Because you're only going to get one shot here, right? If this leaks and that the U.S. government knows where Bin Laden is, wherever he is, he's gone. So the other thing the other order the president gave us was find out what's happening in that compound. Don't tell anybody, find out what's happening in that compound. So we worked really hard to get additional intelligence. And over the next couple months, we learned a handful of additional things. One is we learned that there was extraordinary security being practiced there. Examples. Abu Ahmed was living there with his family, and Abu Ahmed's brother named Abrar was living there with his family. They would only turn their phones on when they were 30 kilometers away from the compound. Otherwise, their phones were never on. The residents of the compound burned their trash instead of putting it out for pickup like everybody else in the neighborhood. This was an upscale neighborhood in Pakistan. This is where rich people lived. There's about 11, 12 kids in the compound. They didn't go to school, unlike all the other kids in the neighborhood. There's no telephone and there's no internet going to the house, unlike all the other houses in the neighborhood. So all this is very suspicious, but none of it tells you anything concrete. We did find out 2 very significant things in the fall of 2010. The first was that there was a 3rd family living inside the compound that never left the compound. Never left the compound. Both Abrar and Abu Ahmed would leave the compound. They would take their families from the compound, but this 3rd family never left. And nobody in the neighborhood knew there was a 3rd family living there. And the second thing we learned was that Abu Ahmed was still working for al-Qaeda. One of the things we worried was that from 2010, which is when the last people saw him, from 2002, right, when the last detainees had seen him, till 2010, that's 8 years, right? It's a long, long time. Maybe he had left al-Qaeda a long time ago. Maybe he was working for a Pakistani drug lord, right? And that was what was going on inside this compound. But we learned that he was still working for al-Qaeda. How we learned those 2 things, right? That 3rd family and that Abu Ahmed was still working for al-Qaeda, I can't tell you. But if I could, you would say that's really cool. So the analysts took all of that, and they came to an analytic conclusion that, and I'm going to use their exact words, there is a strong possibility that Abu Ahmed is harboring Bin Laden at the Abbottabad compound. That was the analytic judgment. It was entirely a circumstantial case. There was no direct evidence whatsoever. But that's how we
So, I mean, and
got
again,
there.
you're going to have to buy the book, because I could take the rest of the day just to take you through the incredible descriptions in here about the meetings that he was present at, of course, with President Obama to talk about the probability that he was there, the methods that were presented to the president. There was another option other than the one that actually did lead to his killing. And, but again, buy the book, because I could spend the rest of the time, and you have questions talking about that. But I do want to talk about a few other things. And again, the book covers so many other subjects as well. Edward Snowden, first a question. How did someone who I can't remember, I think didn't even graduate from college, he dropped out of college, worked for a defense contractor, not a high level position. How did someone like that pick the NSA's pocket?
So he was a really smart kid. He was really capable with computers. Very, very capable. So CIA was the first organization to bring him in to the national security community. We hired him. We hired him in 2009. We hired him as a communicator. So obviously CIA has people all over the world, right? And they need to be able to communicate back to Washington. My case officers need to be able to communicate with their agents. There's all sorts of communication needs. And we were desperate for communicators. We were in Iraq, we were in Afghanistan. And so he was one of hundreds of people who were hired as communicators. And so we were the first. We gave him a security clearance. He was a CIA employee just like I was. And there were some concerns about him, some performance concerns. There were some security concerns about him. And we were in the process of firing him. And he saw all this coming, and so he quit. Right? He quit before he could get fired. And there's inside the U.S. government, there is, in the kind of security clearance system, you know, when one agency is concerned about somebody, they put a flag on their name, right? So that if somebody else would go to give that person a clearance, there's a flag there that says, hey, there's something concerning about this person, call this agency, right, to find out what it is. Turns out that before we got the flag on his name, that a contractor working for NSA hired him. Right, he already had a clearance. The contractor hired him and put him on a contract at NSA. So nobody ever saw the flag. Nobody ever checked it. Nobody ever had a conversation. So maybe this contractor never would have hired him had he seen the flag. Maybe not. Who knows? Never know. Anyway, that's CIA's role in this story, right? So he goes to work for NSA, and he becomes a IT administrator. And those people in the audience here who know what IT administrators do is they keep your network running. And because they're responsible for keeping your network running, they have extraordinary access. Right? They have access to people's passwords. They have access to all sorts of parts of the network that normal employees, even very, very senior ones, don't have access to. And I think, right, we still don't know what motivated this guy. I speculate in the book. I don't like speculating about people's intentions because one of the things I've learned as an analyst over the years is that you're almost always wrong when you speculate about people's intentions. You know, what's Putin's intention in Syria? Very difficult to figure out, right? But I do speculate about Edward Snowden, so I admit it's speculation. So I think Edward Snowden is the classic personality for recruitment by a foreign government, although I don't think he was recruited by a foreign government. What's the classic personality? The classic personality is, I am the brightest guy on the planet, and these organizations that I work for don't recognize that. They don't appreciate me, right? And the way you take advantage of that as an intelligence service is you appreciate them. You appreciate them, right? You tell them how fantastic they are. You tell them how important they are, and they'll do anything for you, right? I don't think that happened in this case. I think what happened in this case is he got angry. He got angry at NSA for not seeing his brilliance, and he decided that he was going to take it out on them by stealing as much stuff as he possibly could. You know, this was not a guy who just stole information related to the privacy of the privacy and civil liberties of Americans. He stole millions and millions and millions of documents. And you know, I don't think we fully understand. I haven't looked at this in 2 years, obviously, but I don't think we still fully understand all the damage he did.
Yeah, there'll be no doubt when you read the book about where you come out on whether he's a hero or a traitor, and just how much damage he's actually done. I'm going to leave it to all of you to ask questions about many of the other things that he talks about, whether it's ISIS, whether it's Iraq, weapons of mass destruction. But just one thing, because the book, as well as being enormously serious and often very troubling, is actually pretty funny at times too. And I just happen to remember one thing in the book when you talk about, people trying to guess at what motivations are and getting them wrong. Tell us what the real motivation was when Saddam Hussein grew all of that beard. We all remember the photo when all of a sudden this guy had always been clean shaven. He now had a beard. What motivated him?
So he was right. He was clean shaven, for a long time. Then he walks into an Iraqi courtroom, right, for his trial, and he's got a beard. And all of the commentators, right, people like me now, right, are commenting, right, on this change in his appearance. And I remember a former CIA psychologist who was, on CNN while this is playing out, saying, he's trying to look more Islamic, right? He's trying to play to the court's, Islamic tendencies. Nonsense, right? If you know the true story. So what happened, right? He was in the custody of the United States of America. A good friend of mine was debriefing him regularly, debriefed him day after day after day. There was one morning when Saddam wasn't feeling well, and so my friend took him to the American Military Hospital, right, to be cared for. And while he was at the hospital being taken care of, he sees this very pretty, very attractive nurse, and he's flirting with her. Is a nice way of putting it. He's flirting with her. And she's paying him absolutely no mind. And on the ride back, to the prison, Saddam says to my friend, she wouldn't pay any attention to me. And my friend says, American women like men with facial hair. You don't have any, Saddam. You don't have any. So he started growing a beard right then and there. It's a true story.
All right. Cindy, Judy have microphones. As you heard earlier, please be brief. A question means something with a question mark at the end of it. Right up in front, and then we'll go back over here, sir.
The government refuses to say the words Islamic terrorism. Is that wise? Would we be better to pinpoint the enemy, or is it better to just be vague?
Look, I understand, I fully understand the president's reluctance to call this what it is. He does not want to offend the 99.9% of Muslims who have absolutely nothing to do with what's going on. I understand his reluctance, right? As part of the Benghazi story, I edited the word Islamic out of a public statement for exactly the same reason, right? I understand that reluctance. The danger, right, the danger in not talking about it is that if you don't talk about it, you really can't define it, and if you can't define it, you can't get your arms around it. Fact of the matter is that there's a small percentage of Muslims who believe that the sacred texts are telling them that violence is inappropriate, that violence is actually a necessary measure to protect the religion and to expand the religion. That they're called on to do this violence, right? And so it is part of the religion. And the president of Egypt, almost a year ago now, January of 2015, gave a speech, a really historic speech in Cairo, saying this is a problem. We as Muslims need to get our arms around it. You can go through the Bible and find hundreds of phrases that make it sound like violence is okay, right, in the defense of religion. And we moved beyond that, right? We as Christians moved beyond that. That's what Muslims have to do with their own religion. They need to move beyond that, that strict interpretation of what the Quran is saying to them. So it is very important, I think, to be able to define it, get your arms around it. But I understand the president's reluctant. It's tough. There was a terrific op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, I think on Saturday, about this very problem. And you should read it. It's very well done.
There was a mention, and again, there's much in the book about Benghazi, and we'll never stop hearing a lot about Benghazi. And just because all of you are fellows of the Aspen Institute, I just mentioned that we are now the managing partner of something called the Christopher Stevens Initiative, which was inspired in memory of our ambassador who was killed in Benghazi. And it's an outreach program to young people in predominantly Muslim countries, and I'd be happy to talk to any of you about it later on. I think this gentleman here, and then up to the front row, and then I need to ask a woman with a question too, please.
I was curious to know whether or not you were in the room or in the process when George Tenet is reported to have said that it was a slam dunk that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction.
So I was not in the room when he said that. He said it. And I say in the book that I've never faulted him for saying that. And the reason I have never faulted him for saying that was because that was the impression that the analysts who came to the conclusion that Saddam had chemical weapons, that Saddam had a biological weapons production capability, that Saddam was restarting his nuclear weapons program. When the analysts talked about it, that's the impression they gave you. They gave you a sense that they were at a high level of certainty that Saddam had these programs. So I've never faulted George for having said that.
Yes, right over here, and then back over here. Just wait for Cindy, please.
Let me say one more thing about that that I think is important, is sometimes it's painted, right, as that's the moment that the president decided to go to war, right? That decision had already been made weeks and weeks and weeks before that. This particular moment, right, was when John McLaughlin, who was then the deputy director of CIA, was outlining for the president what a public case would look like. And it didn't sound very strong to the president, what this public case was going to look like. And the president said, surely this case could be stronger. You know, and that's when George said, look, it's a slam dunk that he's got weapons of mass destruction. We can make this case stronger. That's the context. This was not the determining moment when the president decided to go to war.
You actually make a public apology to Colin Powell in this book.
Right.
Just tell about that if you would.
So Colin Powell, right, made the public case. Colin Powell went to the United Nations and made the public case for Saddam having these programs. And he didn't say anything that the Central Intelligence Agency did not believe. There was no politics at all in what Colin Powell said. And we were wrong. We were absolutely wrong. And in the book, I have a whole chapter that explains why we were wrong, why we said what we said, and then why we were wrong. And it has to do with Saddam again, and Saddam's intentions, and our failures, right, to understand those intentions. Anyway, Colin Powell made this case, and turns out that he's wrong, and he's carried this around on his shoulders, right? He has said publicly that, I think this is going to be on my tombstone, right? This Iraq WMD thing. And he also said a number of times that nobody from CIA ever apologized to me. And so in the book, I apologize. And I didn't want this to be a shock to him, right? That the book comes out and somebody sticks a microphone in his face and says, you know, Michael Morell apologized to you. So I sent him the chapter. I sent him the chapter before the book came out, and he called me. And we talked for 45 minutes. And he was deeply, deeply appreciative of my apology, public apology.
Please.
So we hear an awful lot about ISIS's sophisticated recruiting methods. Can you talk a little bit about what our government is doing to combat that with our own messaging back? We hear very little in the press about that, but I'm sure there's some efforts.
Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, the question is, ISIS has a very sophisticated recruiting methods. And surely the United States must be doing something, right, to fight back, right? What are we doing and how are we doing, right? I'll tell you, it's really, really hard, and here's why it's hard. They've got a narrative. They have two things. They have two advantages, right, when they're talking to kids here in the United States, in Western Europe, in Canada, Australia, other parts of the Muslim world, right? They have two huge advantages. One is they have a narrative. They have a compelling narrative. And their compelling narrative is that the West, led by the United States of America, is trying to destroy our religion. Come and fight with us and defend the religion. You can come and fight with us in Iraq and Syria, or you can fight in the very place where you live by attacking, going out and doing an attack, right? Making these people pay for what it is they're doing to us. That's one advantage they have, is they've got a compelling narrative. The other advantage they have, and they can fit everything we're doing, right, into that narrative. Incorrectly, but they can fit it in there. The other advantage they have is they have the perception that they're winning. So every time there's a successful attack, the downing of the Russian airliner over the Sinai, the Paris attacks, the San Bernardino attacks, they look 10 foot tall. So they look like they're winning. There's a perception that they're winning, and that attracts recruits. That attracts money. The way you get money in the terrorist game is to have successful attacks. People will give you money. If you don't have successful attacks, you don't get as much money. They're in the fundraising business. And so whenever they look 10 foot tall, they get more recruits. How do you fight back, right? It's very difficult to fight back with our own narrative. Because what is our narrative? You're wrong about your narrative? Let us tell you the truth that we're not trying to destroy your religion, right? That doesn't sell to anybody. We have a really hard time saying anything about Islam because we have no credibility in talking about it, because we're not Muslims. If a non-Christian is trying to tell me about my religion, that person's not going to have a lot of credibility, right, in my eyes. So it's a very, very difficult thing to do. There are some efforts at State Department. They've never been funded, in my view, as they should be. But even if they were, it would be a very difficult thing. I will take this opportunity to say something really important, is you really have to divide this problem. I say in the book that this is going to be a generational war. I say in the book that my kids' generation and my grandchildren's generation is still going to be fighting this fight. This is a long war. There's really two pieces to the war, right? One piece to the war is stopping those people who are already radicalized, who are already terrorists, who are trying to kill us. Right? You got to do that, right? They're trying to kill you. You got to do something about them. The only way to deal with them is to take them off the battlefield, either capture them or kill them, right? That's essentially the symptom of the problem, though. The bigger problem, and the other problem you have to deal with, is how do you stop radicalization in the first place? And, for every 1,000 hours that I sat in the Situation Room talking about how to deal with terrorists who already exist, maybe I spent an hour talking with how do you deal with the bigger problem long term, right? And for every $1 million the United States spent on dealing with those guys who already exist trying to kill us, we spent maybe $1 on the bigger counter-radicalization problem. So until we get and we here is the West, the leadership of Muslim countries, Muslim clerics, Muslim parents, until we get our arms around the bigger problem, the symptom of the problem, terrorism, is going to keep coming at us in waves.
Thank you. Al, microphone here, Judy.
There is a question here, and the question is, what are the implications and the underlying circumstances are a rise in the Western world. Is this on?
Yes.
A rise in the Western world in nationalism and populism, with the possible exception of South America. The shock to the developing countries because commodity prices, especially oil, now under $40 a barrel, and of course the rise of non-state terrorism. So as you think about nationalism, populism, commodity prices in the dumpster, what do you think the implications of that confluence, what do you think those implications are?
I think it's bad, right? It's, you know, just you take Russia as an example, right? So the Russians overinvest in oil and gas. The economy is heavily dependent on oil and gas. The price of oil goes from $100 a barrel to, what is it this week? $30-some a barrel. Devastating impact on the Russian economy. How do you deal with that if you're Vladimir Putin? You play the nationalist card, right? I'm not saying that's why he went into Ukraine, but it's certainly an ancillary benefit to him to play that nationalist card. You know, one of the things you have to deal with is in this bigger terrorism problem and this bigger radicalization problem is economic opportunity and economic hope for these young people in the Middle East and in Muslim countries in Northern Africa. And to the extent that those economies depend on commodity prices, right, makes that problem much, much, much more difficult. So it's all intertwined, and you know it's you got to sort it all out.
Yes, let's gentleman on the aisle, and then.
I was just wondering.
Well, actually, we do because it's being recorded. If you wouldn't mind, here it's coming.
How do you feel about the Iran nuclear deal?
That's a great question. It's a great question. I'm torn. I'm really torn, and here's why. Because, look, Iran poses many challenges to the United States of America. Iran wants to be the hegemonic power in the Middle East. What does that mean? Iran wants to have all the influence in the Middle East. Iran wants to, in essence, reestablish the Persian Empire and call all the shots. That's what they want. This is not a desire only on the part of this government. This goes way back in Iranian history. This Shah wanted this, right? So Iran wants to be the hegemonic power in the Middle East. I don't think that's in American interest. Two, Iran is, I think, although there are other state sponsors of terrorism, I believe that Iran is the only country in the world that itself still practices terrorism as a tool of statecraft against its neighbors largely, Israel, Sunni Arab states. You may remember a couple of years ago, acknowledged publicly that the Iranians were planning to kill the Saudi ambassador to the United States in a Washington, D.C. restaurant in Georgetown. And this was not a rogue Iranian operation. This was an operation that went to the highest levels of the Iranian government. Three, Iran supports international terrorist groups. Hezbollah could not exist. Hezbollah, by the way, killed more Americans prior to 9/11 than any other terrorist group. Hezbollah could not exist without the support it gets from Iran. Four, Iran provides support to regional insurgencies in the Middle East. These regional insurgencies are designed to overthrow the Sunni Arab governments, right? So whether you're talking about Yemen or Bahrain or eastern provinces of Saudi Arabia, the Iranians are messing around, arms, money to these Shia insurgents. It's also part of the bigger regional strategy for influence. And then lastly, second to lastly, it is Iranian state policy. It is Iranian state policy for the state of Israel to go away. It's Iranian state policy for the state of Israel to be wiped off the face of the planet. You don't have to believe me. The Supreme Leader says it all the time. He has a 9 or 10 point plan for the elimination of the state of Israel. You can Google it. Iran, Supreme Leader, Israel, 9-point plan. You will find his step-by-step 9-point plan for Israel to go away. And on top of all of that, you can put the cherry, right, on the cherry on the sundae here, the pursuit of a nuclear weapon. So those are all of our problems with the Iranians, okay? So here's why I'm torn. When I read the Iran nuclear deal, I was stunned by how much the Iranians gave away. I was stunned that they were willing to set themselves back as much as they were on their nuclear program. And it was a reflection of their deep, deep desire to get out from underneath the sanctions that were devastating their economy and starting to have a political effect at home. For quite some time, the Supreme Leader was able to blame the sanctions on the West and the damage of those sanctions on the West, but the politics were starting to turn in Iran where the Iranian government was starting to get the blame for these sanctions and for their effect. Right? So they had to get out from underneath these sanctions. And these sanctions, the vast, vast, vast majority of these sanctions were related to the nuclear program. So from a very narrow nuclear program perspective, this is a damn good deal. It really is. The problem is when you put it in the bigger context, and this is why this is the other part of the coin for me. The president gave a speech, right, as this deal was coming to a closure, and in the speech he said, look, we were in a Cold War with the Soviet Union, and we cut arms control agreements with the Soviet Union. That's what we're doing here. Right? We don't like the way these guys behave regionally. We don't like their behavior regionally, but we're cutting a deal here, right, that makes sense for us. And that's absolutely true. But we were doing something else with the Soviet Union at the time that we're not doing with the Iranians. We are not pushing, everywhere the Soviet Union was being bad in the world, we were pushing back against them. At the same time we were cutting arms control agreements, we were pushing back against their malign behavior. We are not pushing back against Iranian malign behavior anywhere. What would an example of that be? An example of that would be Iranian ships going from Iran to Yemen, taking weapons to a Shia insurgency group in Yemen trying to overthrow the Yemeni government. The United States of America watches those ships go. An example of pushing back on Iranian malign behavior would be for the United States Navy to board those ships, and if there's weapons on them, turn them around and send them home. That's pushing back on Iranian behavior. That's what our allies in the region would like us to see, to do more of, pushing back on their bad behavior. So I would feel really comfortable about this nuclear agreement if we were pushing back against their malign behavior to the fullest extent possible. So I'm really torn, right? In the absence of pushing back, I'm torn about the deal itself.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid our time is up. We obviously could continue for hours. It's a real privilege to be here with you. Phil, do you have anything to conclude with?
Just, this has been an awesome afternoon, and we thank you, Michael. We thank you, Elliot.
Thank you. It was terrific.
And books are for sale just outside, and Michael will sign them for you and personalize them, so it'll be a great Christmas
Great
present.
holiday gift.
Happy holidays, everybody. And then the party upstairs.